The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
Where strange lights speed beyond reason across a clear night sky.
The house at the end of the road where disembodied voices whisper and strange noises make the living shiver.
Lurking shadows hiding on the edge of the woods just outside your back door.
Odd, true events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole. I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. I'm Wes, and that's my wife and co-host, Beth.
Hello, everyone. We hope everyone had a good week, and if you celebrated Valentine's Day, we hope it was a good one. So before we jump into our topics tonight, we just wanted to take a minute and tell everyone about our new premium bonus content.
Yeah, Beth and I are pretty excited. In an effort to keep our regular weekly episodes ad-free, we're offering monthly bonus episodes for a small fee.
Also ad-free.
And these bonus episodes will be about all kinds of things that we think are pretty cool, but might not exactly fit with what we do each week in our regular episodes.
Yeah, there's been a bunch of times when we want to go off on a tangent and talk about something that we stumbled across in our research, but it doesn't exactly fit what we do. So the bonus episodes will give us a chance to delve into those things.
Yeah, so check it out. We'd really appreciate it.
And while you're at it, take a quick trip to our merch store on TeePublic, and you might see something there that you like too.
Our link to our store is on our website, whereourmindswander.com. And there's a link on our Facebook page also, so you might want to check that out. So now that all that housekeeping's out of the way, what are you talking about tonight?
Well, perhaps some of our listeners have visited Jamestown or Plymouth Rock or Plymouth Plantation. But I wonder how many wanderers have heard of the colony of Roanoke. It's been featured as a setting in a lot of supernatural-themed TV shows and movies, and it was a real place. 115 colonists lived there. But then it mysteriously became a lost colony, but not just figuratively lost, literally lost. And it's still a 432-year-old unsolved mystery.
Yeah, it's a fascinating mystery for sure.
In 1585, 115 English settlers arrived by 3 ships. The captain of the flagship, John White, was also tasked as governor of the new colony by order of Sir Walter Raleigh. The settlers came upon the former Lane colony, a dismantled and abandoned fort, and made it their home. They moved into the few existing homes and quickly began building a more permanent settlement. Among the settlers was White's wife and pregnant daughter. Life was not easy at Roanoke, which predates Jamestown by 17 years. The weather and soil made farming difficult, and the surrounding native tribes were none too happy to have the invading Europeans as neighbors, occasionally picking off colonists who wandered outside the settlement alone. Can't really blame them there.
Not at all.
But the colony was surviving, overcoming some of these challenges at least. They were able to negotiate a peace agreement with the Powhatan, and White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was born, the first English child born in the Americas. By 1587, the colonists were in some trouble, though. Food was scarce and the supplies were low. John White and a small crew decided to take one of the ships back to England for supplies, expecting to return within a few short months. Meanwhile, if things got too bad, the settlers agreed they would sail for Croatoa, which is present-day Hatteras Island, and resettle there. Unbeknownst to White, however, was that there were some issues between England and Spain back home, and when he got back to England, the British king commandeered White's ship and he wasn't able to return with the supplies for 3 years.
Now, 3 years is a long time to be waiting for supplies. I can imagine they probably gave up hope that he would even return.
I would think so, and they would probably do whatever they could to survive in his absence. So, in August of 1590, White finally makes it back, and he anchors off the coast of Croatoa. He can see plumes of smoke on Roanoke as if campfires or hearth fires were lit. The following morning, he sees more smoke from the settlement. White assumes his colony is doing well, and he doesn't bother asking the Croatoans about his people. Now, I'm not clear on why he didn't go directly to the settlement that day or the following 4 days, but on the 5th evening, on August 17th, he spotted a campfire on the north end of Roanoke. He and some crewmates got in a smaller boat and paddled closer to the shore, but they couldn't make out any people in the dark. So he and his boatmates sang English songs, hoping to hear some yells or singing in response, but they didn't.
Now, I find that very peculiar, that he waited all those days after being gone so long that he wouldn't go immediately check up on them and see what had transpired since he had been gone for 3 years.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe because he saw the campfires, he assumed everything was fine, and maybe he had some other dealings he had to do on Croatoa. Like, I'm not sure either why he waited those extra days. Maybe the sea was rough. Maybe the water was too choppy to make, I don't know.
Perhaps. I still find it kind of peculiar.
Finally, on August 18th, White made landfall on Roanoke. There were fresh tracks on the beach where he came ashore, but I imagine he was a bit puzzled to find the letters C-R-O carved into a tree. But it would have seemed even more weird to him that no one from the colony came to greet him as he and his men approached. A relatively new palisade, which was kind of a stockade fence, had been built around its borders, and the full word Croatoan was carved into one of its gate posts. This, too, was a bit odd. I can assume he still expected to find a bustling settlement on the other side of the fence, though. But when he entered the settlement, he was greeted by silence. Not a single human voice could be heard. No trace of human activity, no cooking fires, no construction, no washing, nothing. Not a single human was inside the walls. In fact, all of the homes had been completely dismantled. Every item removed, leaving just empty rooms. All 115 settlers had vanished. Well, you figure there was some sort of massacre, or maybe an illness had wiped them all out. But there were no signs of battle, no wounded or dead bodies anywhere, and there were no graves. So that nixed the idea of an illness, too, because you'd expect to find graves.
So it's kind of like they vanished into thin air, which is a bit unsettling, but they did take their furniture with them.
They took everything with them. It was like they never existed there at all. So, maybe he had thought, too, that there was a fire, but the abandoned homes were perfectly intact. There was no evidence of anything having been set on fire. So maybe a neighboring tribe had come in and forcibly removed all of the people. Maybe, except there were no signs of looting, there were no signs of struggle, and you'd still expect to find some human remains of those who had refused to be taken. You'd expect to find something, some furniture or household items smashed or broken.
Right.
And it really was as if the colony had never existed at all. Now, White did look for them, at least a little. He sailed back to Croatoa, or Hatteras, and spoke to the native chiefs, but none of them had any knowledge of European settlers coming to their island. They had heard nothing about a European settlement being attacked. They had no idea what had happened to the colonists. So with no leads, White returned to England. There were several search expeditions, although most of them were labeled as other things. See, Walter Raleigh didn't want word getting out that not only had his chartered colony failed, but that all of the inhabitants had vanished into thin air, so he tried to keep things hush-hush. In 1595, White returned to the Chesapeake Bay area, he said, to look for his family. In later years, he admitted he was really searching for El Dorado, so he seems like he was a real peach of a guy.
That he does.
In 1603, Bartholomew Gilbert mounted an expedition to the Chesapeake Bay as well. However, bad weather pushed them slightly off course, and when they made landfall, they were ambushed by natives and the entire landing party was killed. When John Smith arrived in Jamestown 17 years later in 1607, members of the Powhatan tribe told him about men in European clothing and walled houses in a place they called Okanahonan. They also told him of two other places, Panawiki, in which men in European clothes lived, and Packraknik. Smith was given a note that read, quote, "Here remaineth 4 men clothed that came from Roanoke to Okanahonan," end quote. Smith sent word to England and planned to explore these areas himself, but relations with natives were so tense that he couldn't. In 1612, William Strachey of Jamestown wrote a paper in which he claimed the lost colony had moved and lived peacefully for 20 years with a tribe beyond Powhatan territory until an unprovoked massacre wiped out all but 7 of the settlers. So what in the world really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? How do 115 people just disappear without a trace? There are several theories, but each theory has glaring holes. For example, Theory 1. The colonists were wiped out by either a native or Spanish attack. As there were no human remains ever found and the houses were completely cleared out, this seems pretty unlikely. The native population, or the Spanish for that matter, would not have had any interest in their furniture and cooking utensils. Even if the colonists were forced to board ships, it seems unlikely that someone would have come back and taken all of their stuff, too. Theory 2 is that some sort of natural disaster happened. But again, how did their homes become wiped clean of all traces? And there most likely would have been some human remains. Theory 3 is that they tried to return to England. Since both of the other 2 ships were gone, it is possible they did try to return, and yet both ships would have had to have been lost at sea, since there is no record of them ever arriving anywhere. Theory 4. They did pack up and move out. Some historians believe they splintered into smaller groups, some heading to Croatoa, some towards Chesapeake Bay, and some to the mainland. Yet again, there are no written records of anyone claiming they were from the Roanoke colony, and there's little recent DNA evidence from established family lines that have come back conclusive. Now, in 2012, a map that White had drawn, which is housed at the British Museum, was found to have invisible ink drawings on it, supposedly in case it fell in the hands of the Spanish. That indicates a fort some 50 miles west of Roanoke. In 2015, the First Colony Foundation began excavating the former site and found 24 shards of English pottery. The foundation is claiming that this is proof that at least some of the Roanoke colonists ended up there. But I'm not sure I agree. The entire area was being colonized, and trade was huge between the native population and the Europeans. So, I don't know. Adding to the puzzle, there is supposedly a tree on Hatteras, which was formerly Croatoa, with the letters C-O-R-A carved into them. I'm more apt to say that Cora was a pretty popular girl's name for centuries, but some historians believe it might be another clue, that the colonists left Croatoa and moved on to the Coree Indian settlement. But there is no corroborating evidence as far as I could find. Plus, the chief on Croatoa said he had no idea where they had gone. He hadn't seen them.
Or perhaps maybe he did, and he didn't want a war to ensue, and maybe they just wiped them all out.
But then where was all their stuff?
I don't know.
If it was on a ship, did they, sink the ship?
Well, perhaps they did break off and move their furniture onto these ships, and either they made landfall somewhere else, each going in different directions, or the ship sank. But you think that there would have been remains found of those ships.
Something.
Mm-hmm.
So how were there fires burning on an uninhabited beach in those first few days of White's search? Were they the ghosts of colonists? Did something happen there that tied their spirits to the land? Or is the lost settlement as empty of answers as their abandoned homes were, just barren shells with no truths to reveal? We often refer to it as the lost colony, which removes the human connection, I think. We don't have to really face the truth that the colony was made up of 115 men, women, and children who all made some sort of choice that we may never discover.
I do find that kind of funny that there was smoke and everything.
Yeah. And if he saw these campfires, but then when he got there, he said that there was no evidence of the campfires, that there was no evidence of anybody being there.
Very strange.
Well, if any of this sounds familiar, it might be, depending on what TV shows you watch. Several popular shows that delve into the paranormal have covered it, some giving mere nods to the history and some downright setting entire episodes or seasons there. Supernatural did an episode in homage to Roanoke, for example.
Yes, they did. Well, that was pretty interesting, dear.
I love stories that have no answer. I've said it before, because they drive me nuts. Hey, did you know? Helene Adelaide Shelby came up with a unique way to get bootleggers and moonshiners to talk in the 1920s. Banking on the prevalent fear of the paranormal, she patented a confession-hearing skeleton. Outfitted with a microphone and red, glowing eyes, the skeleton would materialize in a dark room where the suspected criminal was seated, hopefully scaring them into a confession with its otherworldly questions, which were asked through the microphone by a cop in another room. Although she did receive a patent, there are no known records of the skeleton trick ever being used by a police department. Who'da thunk it? So what are you talking about tonight?
Well, I thought I would tell you about Nandor Fodor, a gentleman that should definitely be more recognized and mentioned in the paranormal research community. But he isn't ever really talked about or even given credit for his contribution to the paranormal field.
I've never heard of him.
So for those of you who are interested in the paranormal, the names Hans Holzer and Harry Price are familiar ones. But what about Nandor Fodor? The first two names are most likely names that you've heard about before, either on this show or on various TV programs, where today's ghost hunters pay homage to the original fathers of the paranormal. They were pioneers in their field, investigating cases from the Perron family to the Cottingley fairies, to Jeff the Talking Mongoose.
Jeff the Talking Mongoose.
Hans Holzer engaged mediums to help him figure out just what exactly was going on in haunted places, while Harry Price debunked mediums in order to figure out what was going on in haunted places. But what about Nandor Fodor? His name is not one you hear mentioned, although his theories are a huge part of today's understanding of the ghostly realm. Most ghost hunting shows rely on his theories when doing investigations, and yet sadly, no one seems to mention him by name. So, who was Nandor Fodor, and what exactly did he do? Nandor was the leading figure behind the idea that poltergeists are a manifestation of the subconscious mind.
Oh, so that really is a very popular theory right now.
Yes, and he was proving his theory back in the 1930s.
Wow.
So with that said, you can probably imagine that he made some enemies along the way. Most of them were spiritualists. Nandor also inspired some very important people, like Shirley Jackson, who wrote The Haunting of Hill House.
And that's an excellent book.
So, who exactly was he, and how did he come up with his theories of a connection between poltergeists and the subconscious mind. Nandor was born in Hungary in 1895. At some point in his childhood, he had his own paranormal experience, which sparked his lifelong interest in the supernatural. His academic career began in law. Nandor earned his law degree from the Royal Hungarian University of Science in 1917, and he served as a law assistant during World War I. But then he switched to journalism, focusing on articles about the paranormal from 1921 to 1928. It was during this time that Nandor traveled to the U.S. for a story, and he happened to come across a book in a used bookshop in New York City that changed his world. Herwood Carrington's Modern Psychic Phenomenon. Suddenly, Nandor had a new direction in his research and writing, and psychical research. Nandor is quoted as saying, "This work was a revelation to me. From then on, I spent my lunch money on books, feasting on psychic knowledge in preference to the nourishing food of the Hungarian restaurants near my work." Intrigued, Nandor reached out to Carrington, hoping to interview him, but Carrington had a better idea. He invited Nandor to attend a reception for none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Nandor ended up scoring an interview with Doyle. Now, Beth and I have talked about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's involvement with the spiritualism movement a few times.
Yes, we have.
Doyle happened to be a huge supporter. But he and Carrington were only the first two in a long line of influential people who Nandor befriended. Sandor Ferenczi, an associate of Sigmund Freud, was a leading psychoanalyst in 1926. Nandor was able to interview him as well, and he became utterly fascinated with Freud's theories of repressed memories. Nandor took a huge leap into psychoanalysis, and he was interested to discover that both Ferenczi and Sigmund Freud secretly felt that psychical phenomena was a real thing. So, in other words, both of them secretly felt that people's trauma could manifest in physical ways, although I don't think either one of them ever expressed that in their writings. But maybe they did. I've never studied Freud.
Me neither.
But with that said, I'm definitely going to be doing a little bit more research into Freud myself. Needless to say, Nandor was hooked, eventually combining the idea of supernatural with the research of psychoanalysis, and he became a leader in proving the link between the two, especially when it came to mediums and poltergeist. But not quite yet. Nandor was still on his journey towards his ultimate theory. In 1929, Nandor was hired by Lord Rothermere, who owned several British newspapers, including the Daily Mail, Daily Mirror, and the Evening News. Nandor moved to England, and during his off hours, he completed his first major work, the Encyclopedia of Psychic Science. When asked why he compiled it, he said, quote, "What we need is a standard work, which in a dispassionate, detached, and impersonal manner presents all the facts of history, research, phenomena, and mediumship, in which, at a minute's notice, we can lay our hands on every important fact." End quote. Basically, the ones that already existed were still content-specific, like Conan Doyle's History of Spiritualism, and he wanted everything in one comprehensive book. It took several years, and it was published in 1936.
Well, now I want to look for it on Amazon and see if I can buy a copy. It sounds really cool.
With the publishing of his book, it pushed Nandor to the forefront as the premier expert in the field of psychical research. But prior to his encyclopedia being published in 1934, he was hired as the assistant editor of Light, which was the oldest spiritualism journal in Britain. And it meant that he was invited to witness experiments involving mediums. Initially, he was like an excited schoolboy, shouting and jumping at each piece of evidence that mediums produced. But his initial belief that everything they did was genuine didn't last long, obviously. Also that year, the International Institute for Psychical Research was founded. This group combined both believers in spiritualism and non-believers, Nandor found himself president. And one of his most important cases was about to begin. Nandor had been following Alma Fielding's case pretty closely. 34-year-old housewife Fielding claimed that china would fly off the shelves in her home. In her kitchen, eggs would fly off the counter. She'd find herself inexplicably wearing stolen jewelry. At times, animals would suddenly appear in odd places. For example, white mice would come out of her handbag. Swarms of beetles would scurry out from under her gloves on a table. And once, a turtle somehow materialized in her lap during a car ride.
Oh my gosh. At first I was going to say maybe she wasn't a very good housekeeper, but now I think she would be a very interesting road trip companion.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind going on a road trip with her.
As a turtle suddenly appears in her lap.
It'd literally be a trip. Suddenly, journalists all over were reporting on the poltergeist in Alma Fielding's home, and Nandor went to investigate. Now remember, Nandor was a huge fan of Sigmund Freud and fascinated by the idea of repressed memories. Nandor brought Alma Fielding to the Institute in London and conducted several experiments that were recorded both with cameras and voice recorders. He even took X-rays. He determined that she did have scratches on her arms, which she claimed were given to her by a spectral tiger.
A spectral tiger? Do you think he knows the spectral moose?
Quite possibly he could. And puncture wounds on her throat, which she claimed came from a winged beast.
That doesn't sound pleasant at all.
She also told him that she had been impregnated by the angry spirit in the middle of the night, and Nandor literally watched her stomach expand before his eyes.
That's crazy.
Not just Nandor, but other members of the team witnessed a bunch of odd things simply materialize, including a lamp, a brooch, a bird, and a mouse. Yep.
That's a lot.
Each time one of these strange manifestations occurred, Fielding seemed to go into a sort of a trance, which Nandor strongly believed was because she was subconsciously manifesting these events with the power of her mind. That her own personal, undealt with trauma, including the loss of several children and severe health issues, were overwhelming to her to the point of a dissociative state, and that a spirit wasn't conjuring these things. He felt that Alma Fielding was literally pulling these things out of thin air without any conscious knowledge of doing it. And the X-rays pretty much proved it. Several of the conjured items were found on her person, even though she adamantly denied knowledge of them. His groundbreaking theory was polarizing. Was it possible that poltergeist activity was caused by living people with repressed emotions? Were they manifesting activities during dissociative states? As you can imagine, his theory was considered so outlandish that it went over like a lead balloon in the circle of his peers. The International Institute for Psychical Research kindly asked him to leave.
Jeez, he lost his job because of his theory.
Right.
That's awful. But anyway, keep going.
Which is ironic, since if you watched any ghost hunting shows today, it seems to be the understanding that all of them have. When confronted with alleged poltergeist activity, one of the first questions most paranormal investigators ask are, do you have any teenagers? And is anyone under a lot of stress?
That's very true. That's what they do, especially the teenager thing.
But luckily, back in 1939, Freud was in Nandor's corner. He contacted Nandor after Nandor's wife sent Freud a copy of his report on Alma Fielding, and concluded that Nandor was undoubtedly right. Nandor was welcomed into the psychoanalyst circles with open arms. 20 years later, Nandor was still writing and still publishing his ideas. In 1958, he returned to the Alma Fielding case, saying, quote, "A dissociated woman is not necessarily bound by considerations of ethics and logic. She is not ruled by approved social instincts. She is governed by her unconscious mind, which has its own standards of conduct." End quote. He basically went on to say that Alma Fielding most likely had no idea what she was doing in those trance-like states, and that her fear of a poltergeist was real because she had no idea it was herself. And frankly, maybe that's just as frightening, if not more frightening, than the idea of a ghost in your house.
I think it's more frightening. I mean, if you think about it, if the things that are going on in your house are being caused by someone who's living in your house but doesn't even realize they're doing it, you know, they're causing things to fly off of shelves or things to get moved, like that is really frightening that our mind has that much power.
Well, and here's the thing. You're trapped in your own mind.
Right.
The mind is just so powerful. Author Shirley Jackson thought so too. She had already come up with the idea of the haunting of Hill House when she came across a book about 19th century psychical researchers renting a house to perform some experiments and research. But when she came across Nandor's book, Haunted People, she knew she had the basis for her main character. If you haven't read The Haunting of Hill House, I highly recommend it. In it, the character of Eleanor is invited to a huge mansion for an extended period of time by none other than a parapsychologist named Dr. Montague.
So was Dr. Montague's character based on Nandor?
Yes, he was, at least partially.
That's so cool, and that's one of my favorite books.
Eleanor is a treasure trove of hidden traumas, and the poltergeist activity at the mansion becomes super intense. Interestingly enough, some of Eleanor's experiences in the fictional novel mirror some of the real-life events in Nandor's book. And even more interestingly, when the book was turned into a movie just 4 years after the publication in 1959, who was the consultant on the film? You guessed it, Nandor Fodor.
That is so cool. It sounds to me like he expanded the understanding of the paranormal in a huge way. And I had no idea that he even existed or that he was proving it like 90 years ago, because I honestly thought that it was a much more recent theory.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine that 90 years ago, he was breaking ground in paranormal research. And I really think he deserves a lot more recognition than he gets.
I do too.
You know, it's just sad because I like Hans Holzer, and, we hear a lot about the Warrens, which, I'm not a fan of, but I will leave my
opinions at the door.
I will definitely leave my opinions out on what I think about them. But Nandor Fodor really deserves some modern day recognition as far as I'm concerned.
I agree with you.
Well, I guess that about wraps it up for this episode.
I think so. And if you would like to delve deeper into tonight's stories, be sure to check out our show notes for all of our sources. And we will see all of you wanderers next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
Thank you all for your continued support.
See you all next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.